Keanu Reeves stepped through the grand revolving doors of St. Augustine Cancer Institute, his arrival unnoticed by the doctors in crisp white coats and the well-dressed visitors moving through the marble-floored lobby. The hospital was a beacon of medical excellence, a place where the wealthy and the fortunate came seeking cutting-edge treatment. It was also, unknown to most, an institution he had quietly funded and overseen for years. Yet, today, dressed in a well-worn hoodie, faded jeans, and a pair of sneakers that had seen better days, he was just another face in the crowd. The air inside was sterile, the soft hum of distant beeping monitors mingling with the low murmur of voices. Nurses moved efficiently between hallways, their eyes fixed on digital tablets, while security guards stood watchful near the entrance. Keanu paused for a moment, taking in the scene. He had come unannounced, without an entourage or press, hoping to see firsthand how his hospital functioned, not in numbers or reports, but in the way it touched the lives of those it was meant to serve. A woman behind the front desk caught sight of him as he approached. Her expression shifted almost immediately, her professional smile tightening into something more scrutinizing. She looked him over, from his unshaven face to the frayed edges of his hoodie, and made a silent judgment. Her voice, though polite, carried the unmistakable undertone of dismissal. This hospital was not open to loiterers, and to her, he appeared to be just that. Without giving him a chance to explain his presence, she gestured toward the doors, her tone cool but firm. This was a facility for patients, their families, and authorized personnel, people who belonged. Keanu remained calm, his hands tucked into his pockets as he listened. He didn't argue, didn't reveal his identity. There was no need to wield his name like a key to open doors that should be welcoming to all. Instead, he nodded, casting one last glance at the pristine surroundings before turning back the way he came. As he stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the weight of the moment settled over him. It wasn't anger that gripped him but a deep, unsettling realization. If this was how they treated a stranger in need of nothing, how would they treat someone who truly needed their help? The morning sun cast a soft golden glow over the entrance of St. Augustine Cancer Institute, illuminating the well-manicured hedges and the polished glass doors that reflected the city skyline. Keanu Reeves stood just beyond the threshold, his hands still tucked into the pockets of his worn hoodie. The cold breeze that swept through the hospital's grand exterior felt almost symbolic, a quiet contrast to the warmth that should have existed inside. For a moment, he simply observed. Across the driveway, a sleek black car rolled up to the curb, its engine purring as a valet in a pressed uniform rushed forward to open the door. A man in an expensive suit stepped out, adjusting his cufflinks as a hospital administrator emerged from inside to greet him with an enthusiastic handshake. Laughter and pleasantries were exchanged, their words meaningless but their body language clear. This man was important. His presence was a privilege. Further down the sidewalk, another car arrived, this one more modest. A woman in a tailored dress stepped out, followed by a young girl clutching a tablet. They were led inside swiftly, no questions asked. Keanu watched as the receptionist, the same one who had dismissed him moments ago, straightened her posture, her demeanor shifting instantly. The unspoken hierarchy was unmistakable. Some people were welcomed before they even asked. Others never got the chance to speak. A few feet away, near the side of the entrance, a janitor struggled with an overloaded cart stacked with cleaning supplies. The wheels wobbled unsteadily, threatening to send the contents toppling over. His uniform bore signs of long hours, stains from chemical solutions, faded fabric from repeated washes, but no one offered to help. His presence was invisible, just another cog in the machine, essential yet unnoticed. Beyond the glass doors, a nurse rushed down the corridor, her steps hurried, her face drawn with exhaustion. A clipboard was clutched in one hand, her other adjusting the strap of her mask as she navigated between bustling doctors and patients in wheelchairs. Keanu saw the tension in her shoulders, the weight of too many responsibilities pressed onto one person. She moved with purpose, but her presence went largely ignored by the suits who stood idly by, absorbed in discussions about funding and expansion projects. Then, at the far edge of the entrance, Keanu noticed something that made him take a slow, measured breath. An elderly man stood near the reception desk, gripping a stack of papers that trembled slightly in his hands. His clothes were neat but worn, the edges of his sleeves frayed from years of use. His expression held quiet desperation, an attempt at dignity, though it was slipping away with every second. The woman at the desk shook her head, tapping something on her screen before gesturing toward the exit. The man hesitated, his lips parting as if he wanted to plead his case, but the receptionist's attention had already moved elsewhere. It was over before it had even begun. He turned, shoulders sagging, and shuffled toward the doors, stepping back into the world that had just rejected him. Keanu exhaled slowly. Despite the hospital's reputation for excellence, despite the millions that flowed into its research programs and state-of-the-art technology, something was fundamentally broken. Not in the machines, not in the science, but in the way humanity had been stripped from the very place that was meant to preserve life. He had built this institution with the hope that it would serve as a sanctuary. But now, as he stood among those it had failed, he understood that a name on a building meant nothing if the heart inside it was hollow. Keanu lingered near the hospital entrance, his mind heavy with the reality of what he had just witnessed. The sharp contrast between those welcomed with open arms and those turned away without a second thought left an ache in his chest. He had always believed in quiet generosity, in doing good without seeking recognition. But now, watching the hospital he had built operate with such cold efficiency, he wondered if anonymity had allowed something vital to slip through the cracks. A faint aroma drifted through the air, something warm and familiar cutting through the sterility of the hospital grounds. He turned his head toward the small gathering at the edge of the sidewalk, where a group of volunteers stood behind folding tables, ladling soup into disposable cups and handing out sandwiches wrapped in brown paper. A handwritten sign hung off the table, its letters slightly smudged, but the message was clear: free meals for families in need. Keanu approached quietly, watching as people shuffled forward, some hesitantly, as if ashamed to accept help, others with exhaustion in their eyes, too tired to pretend they didn't need it. A mother with dark circles under her eyes held her child close as she accepted a meal, murmuring words of gratitude. An older man, his coat too thin for the season, carefully unwrapped his sandwich as if it were the first meal he'd had in days. The volunteers moved with quiet efficiency, offering more than just food. A woman with silver-streaked hair placed a comforting hand on a young man's shoulder as he spoke, his words tumbling out in uneven breaths. Another volunteer helped an elderly woman adjust the blanket wrapped around her frail frame, listening intently as she recounted a story from years past. These small gestures, unspoken yet deeply felt, carried more warmth than anything Keanu had seen inside the hospital walls. He stayed, blending into the group, listening. Stories spilled forth, carried by voices that wavered between resignation and quiet hope. A father spoke of selling his car to cover a fraction of his son's medical bills, only to be told it wasn't enough. A woman described the endless battle of paperwork, the cold bureaucracy that decided who was worthy of care and who wasn't. Even some of the doctors, those who had dedicated their lives to healing, whispered about the restrictions placed upon them, how sometimes, despite their oaths, they had to turn people away. It was here, in this unassuming corner of the sidewalk, that Keanu saw the humanity he had hoped to build within the hospital. Not in its gleaming corridors or multi-million-dollar equipment, but in the hands that passed a bowl of soup to a hungry mother, in the quiet reassurance offered to a grieving husband, in the kindness given without expectation of anything in return. A volunteer, wiping his hands on his apron, spoke words that settled deep within Keanu's chest. Hospitals were not just about medicine. They were about people. About dignity. About warmth. Keanu let the truth of it sink in. His hospital had everything money could buy, but it was missing the one thing that mattered most. The morning sun rose over St. Augustine Cancer Institute, casting long shadows across its sleek glass exterior. Inside, the hospital hummed with the usual rhythm of its daily operations, doctors making their rounds, administrators shuffling between meetings, and visitors filling waiting rooms. It was another day of business as usual, except for one crucial difference. Keanu Reeves entered the hospital once again, but this time, he was not the unnoticed visitor in a hoodie and worn-out jeans. Today, he was dressed sharply in a tailored suit, his quiet presence magnified by the hospital board members flanking him. The air around him shifted as soon as they stepped inside. The receptionist at the front desk, the same woman who had so easily dismissed him the day before, looked up from her monitor. For a split second, confusion flickered in her eyes, followed quickly by a dawning realization. The casual man she had deemed unimportant, the one she had briskly sent away, was now standing before her in a position of undeniable authority. Her breath hitched, her fingers frozen above the keyboard, as the weight of her mistake settled over her like a crushing wave. Around them, hushed murmurs rippled through the lobby. Hospital administrators, staff, and even security personnel straightened their postures, their movements now deliberate and cautious. The very same people who had walked past Keanu without a second glance the day before were now desperate to acknowledge him. Some shuffled forward, eager to make amends, their polished shoes clicking against the pristine floors as they hurried to offer greetings and apologies. The atmosphere grew tense as the staff scrambled to adjust, as if trying to rewrite the past 24 hours in an instant. The receptionist opened her mouth, her voice faltering as she attempted to explain, to justify, to correct her previous oversight. Others stood by, waiting for an inevitable reprimand, their eyes darting between one another, hoping to deflect responsibility. But Keanu did not react with anger. He did not demand excuses or explanations. Instead, he raised a hand, a simple yet commanding gesture that silenced the clamor around him. The weight of the moment was not in what he had the power to do, but in what he chose to say next. His voice was calm, steady, but it carried the force of something undeniable. He spoke not as the benefactor of this institution, not as a figure admired from afar, but as a man who had walked these very halls unseen. He recounted his experience from the previous day, the indifferent glances, the way a simple outfit had rendered him insignificant in the eyes of those entrusted with care. He described the people he had met outside, those turned away, those overlooked, those who found more kindness on a sidewalk than within the walls of a hospital meant to serve them. Then, he posed the question that settled over the room like a quiet storm. If a man in simple clothes wasn't welcome here, what did that say about the values they upheld? Silence followed, stretching uncomfortably between them. No one had an answer. The hospital, for all its prestige and medical advancements, had failed at the most fundamental level. It had measured worth by appearance, prioritized status over need, and lost sight of the very mission it was built upon. Keanu let the truth of it linger, his gaze sweeping across the faces before him. He was not interested in excuses. He was here for change. A wave of silent reflection passed through the room. The hospital's staff, administrators, and board members stood motionless, the weight of Keanu's words pressing against them. The unspoken reality was now impossible to ignore. This institution, built to heal, had allowed something essential to decay within its walls. It had become efficient, prestigious, respected, but not kind. Keanu did not linger in the discomfort of their silence. Instead, he took action. His first order was clear: kindness would no longer be treated as an afterthought. Every patient, every visitor, every individual who stepped through these doors would be met with dignity and care, regardless of their appearance, background, or financial status. Respect would no longer be reserved for those who could afford it. The bureaucratic barriers that had turned the hospital into an exclusive club were dismantled. Policies were restructured, ensuring that those in need would not be buried under paperwork or turned away because of insurance gaps. Systems were put in place to make treatment accessible, not just to those who had wealth, but to those who had nowhere else to turn. The staff, from the highest-ranking administrators to the janitors who kept the halls clean, were reminded of their purpose. Training programs were implemented, not just for medical expertise, but for empathy. The hospital was no longer just a facility, it was a sanctuary. Patients were no longer cases to be managed, they were people to be cared for. Days passed, then weeks. Slowly, changes took root. The reception desk that had once been a gatekeeper to privilege became a place of welcome. The hurried footsteps of nurses now carried something lighter, knowing they were not forced to choose between care and policy. Even the hospital's donors took notice, their interest shifting from exclusive events to genuine contributions that made a difference in lives beyond the elite. Yet, despite all that had changed within the hospital walls, Keanu knew his work was not finished. One evening, as the city lights flickered against the glass exterior of St. Augustine Cancer Institute, he stepped outside once more. The volunteer station, the place where he had first seen compassion thriving in the shadows of bureaucracy, was still there. The tables remained set up, the aroma of warm soup still drifting into the cool air, and the same quiet hands passed meals to those in need. This time, Keanu did not stand on the sidelines as an observer. He rolled up his sleeves, took his place among the volunteers, and began serving. He handed out meals, listened to stories, and sat with those who had been overlooked for too long. His presence was not an act of charity, it was a commitment, a promise that change was not just about policies and directives, but about action and presence. In that moment, he was not the hospital's benefactor, not the revered celebrity, not the man whose name carried weight. He was simply one person helping another. And that, he realized, was the kind of leadership that truly mattered.